The solution to housing prices might not be increasing the building's height. Why? Because of light. Let's assume this is the city's grid. Now, there's a certain demand for people wanting to live in a city. It's because of the city. It's kind of a paradox. Because there are so many people in there, because there are therefore companies and shops and also other people, people want to live in the city. So maybe the city has a center. An old center, let's just say it's a European old city, and it is round because it used to be a castle, a medieval castle maybe. So this is the old town, the center. And in the old town we might have a landmark, and this landmark might be a church tower. And in the old town, that's the highest building. Now, some time ago, I made a video stating that why not just increase the height of the buildings? Because in many European cities, Munich for example, there is a cap on how high buildings can be. At least in the proximity of the old town. If it's far out, then this might be a little bit different, and there might be skyscrapers, for example, outside. Now Frankfurt, for example, also in Germany, also has skyscrapers, and also in the old town. Now the question is, what does happen when you build a skyscraper next to the old town or outer? Or what does happen in a city like New York? And how does this affect light? Now, ideally, simplified, the light just comes from above. And since the light is kind of fixed in terms of its intensity, because it's the sun usually, the light is also fixed on the surface. So any given surface only has as much of the surface is covered by the sun. If we now take away certain parts here, then the ground itself also reflects a little bit, as the ground here, for example, is white. Therefore, everything else is illuminated a little more, the more we take away. But of course, we cannot take all things away, and then nature would just regrow, and we would have plants and trees. But we want to have the city, so therefore we take something like this, something like a medieval wall around the old town. We also have a church tower, so we might leave the church tower in here. But now, of course, the higher buildings are, the more in a given surface area of the city surface we can use of this area in order to house people. Because if a building is twice as high, it can house twice as many people. At least if the building is not constantly falling. Now, housing prices are basically a function of the demand of a certain house in the city, but not just a certain house, but all the houses. And of course, they just reflect people's desires. If there is a lot of demand for a certain city, then housing prices might go up. Because if I want to move in here, but my neighbor or my previous neighbor or just somebody else also might want to move in here, but he has $10 million and I do not, then he might be willing to pay just a little bit more to move in here. So therefore, as there is a competition among buyers, among renters, the price goes eventually up. The average price of an apartment goes eventually up. So now, given that there is a cap on here, let's just say the cap is as old as the church tower, as high as the church tower, then we have to take this cap off here, because then maybe it's as high as the church tower. The same might be true for another building, which we also are building in proximity to the old town. Now, of course, what you also are already seeing is that there are shadows, and not always the sun is directly above, so the shadows are not always minimized. I mean, ideally, if something is directly coming from above, then the shadow is a circle, as you see. It is still there, it is still also directly under, but there is also just a little bit of a shadow directly around something itself. Now, as the sun moves and the earth moves, both the shadow and the sun, and there is also a reason why there are sun clocks, because obviously kind of both move and create different shadows in the different seasons and days of the year. Now, the more buildings we build, the more space we take up, and the less space down below, the less surface area is reflecting. So therefore, one is making by building more in order to maybe alleviate, or in order to maybe just soften the housing prices a little bit by just building higher, by just theoretically allowing people to build higher or companies to build higher, one is increasing the amount of darkness that is down here. And the more building volume in total we have over a given city, the less light we have down here. And this might be, in total, why building higher, apart from the concerns of having landmarks, might just not be very useful, or just might have the large downside of decreasing basically living quality in the city, because we are natures that are driven by light. If you want to dive into this, then I would recommend Huberman. And Andrew Huberman, is a professor at Stanford, and he has a podcast where he talks about light. So there are, for example, of course, your eyes, and there are also other parts of your body which are kind of light sensitive. And now, depending on where the light comes from, and depending on what the light actually consists of in terms of wavelength, you react differently. In the morning, you are waken up by usually blue light. And then as the day goes on and the sun goes down, the light begins to become more reddish until there is the sun dawn. No, the sun set actually, not the dawn. And then you are beginning to feel tired. So now, the less light there is down below, the less livable a city becomes, and therefore the higher in total the buildings are allowed to build, the less valuable the space actually here might become. People might still be willing to move there. Let's take New York as an example, but it just might also decrease the quality of living there. Therefore, maybe the demand goes down, maybe it does not. But in order to keep living quality in a given city high, it just seems that capping the height at which buildings are allowed to build seems like a good method to keep living quality high.